have Dr. Holly Norton from the History Colorado's Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. She is the director of the office. She's the state archaeologist, and she's also the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, so she has plenty of titles. So now I'm just going to turn it over to Holly, and we'll get going.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. And I appreciate everybody being with me this morning. And please bear with me. While I have been on many, many Zoom meetings for the last 2 months, this will be my first webinar. So you are all a bit of my guinea pigs. But I'm really excited today to talk about the El Pueblo Archaeology Project. I could talk about this project for hours, so I promise that I will only keep you here for like 2 or 3 tops. This is one of my favorite subjects. As the state archaeologist and the DSHPO, most of my work is with compliance, and I'm really fortunate that I get to work with federal agencies, state agencies, CAS, local historic societies, and trying to come up with solutions to their preservation problems. But when I have the opportunity, I also really love to do research. And so being able to work on the El Pueblo site has been a real treat for me over these last couple of years. And so I'm excited to share it with you. I am going to turn my video off so that it's not distracting to any of us while we watch this, or while I talk about the slideshow. I'm always up for questions. One of the things I find a little off-putting about these Zoom webinars is they're not more interactive. So I don't get to see your beautiful faces and see you either smiling or grimacing at me as you understand or don't understand a point I'm making. So please, 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 lots of questions are great. And I'm happy to stick around to chat at the end of this for as long as it takes to get everybody's questions answered. Let me figure just one thing out. And aha, I found the button. All right, here we go. So the El Pueblo Archaeology Project. Sorry, hold on, my slides are not advancing. Okay, here we are. So for much of the 19th century, Colorado was a frontier, mostly for Anglo-Americans. Obviously, there were a lot of other people who were already living in what we now know as Colorado. Both the Santa Fe and the Overland Trails passed through what is now our state, moving new people into a region that was already occupied by Native American tribes, some of whom had been there for thousands of years, and some of whom had migrated into the region in more recent time periods. Directly to the south was Mexico, Nuevo Mexico, a territory of independent Mexico, and a region with their own related but different colonial past. El Pueblo was constructed on what was then the international Mexican-American border, which was the Arkansas River. It was part of an unorganized system of trading posts along what was considered the western frontier. And these trading posts served a variety of functions, again, for the largely Anglo-Americans who established them. They were first and foremost a way to make a quick buck on the frontier, but they were also the first line of colonialism. They occupied very valuable positions, generally along well-established travel routes in Indian country. These trading posts were also de facto American government institutions. The first military fort in Colorado was Fort Massachusetts, and that was not established until 1852. So prior to that, the military made use of private commercial ventures like Bent's Fort, not only for restocking themselves and getting supplies and communication, but also to have a base for their presence. Bent's Fort was by far the largest and most successful trading post of the region and era, and it was run by William Bent and Seraine St. Vrain. It was located along the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail. So contrary to kind of popular conceptions, the Santa Fe Trail wasn't just, you know, a single two-track being cut across the Great Prairies. It was a route between east and west, but it meandered, it was wide in some areas, it was thin in some areas. And in some places, like here in Colorado, along here, you can actually see that it's split. And so you could either take a Cimarron route or the mountain route. Bent's Fort was also a really popular stop for travelers, who, it was reported, could get a cool glass of lemonade with ice any time of the year. Bent traded supplies from St. Louis for furs from trappers, along with buffalo robes from Plains Indians, such as the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. He also depended on the revenue generated by the use of his fort by US military groups and troops that moved through the area. And you'll have to excuse me, my dog is nosing my papers at the moment. So El Pueblo never reached the size or prosperity of Bent's Fort. And in fact, the history of the fort is in many ways unremarkable, although there are aspects of El Pueblo's existence that set it apart from other forts in the region in this era. I also think there are very important relationships between Bent's Fort and El Pueblo that have largely gone unnoticed by history and by historians that I'm hoping the archaeology is really helping us to elucidate. The founders of Bent's Fort were old-timey Western personalities, many of whom went on to have other adventures that became part of the identity of the Romantic West. The founders included men such as James Beckworth, and that's this gentleman in the middle, a self-emancipated African-American slave who hailed from Virginia and purportedly lived with the Crow tribe for 20 years. George Simpson, who is on the right of the screen, was a longtime trader for Bent. Matthew Kincaid, a naturalized Mexican citizen who owned a distillery in Taos and who later became a wealthy and prominent Californian. Not wealthy and prominent enough, however, to leave any photos for us to find to use in our PowerPoints, as well as a handful of other Old West style characters. The gentleman on the left of your screen is Uncle Dick Wooten, excuse me, who himself was quite a character and created an entire living on creating this kind of mountain man image of himself. Many of these trappers and traders at El Pueblo married Mexican women, and that really pivoted the life of the trading post towards Taos. We know very little about these women, often not even their names. One of the few women whose names we do know is Teresita Sandoval. So Teresita was a thoroughly modern woman. In Taos, she met Matthew Kincaid and when she was married to his neighbor. The two fell in love and she left with Kincaid to help found El Pueblo, and she took all of her children with her. One of those daughters married 34-year-old George Simpson when the daughter was just 1 month shy of her 15th birthday. We know so much about this because later Teresita actually drug Simpson into court in New Mexico and won a lawsuit against him for domestic violence against her daughter. So Teresita was not one to be trifled with. After moving to El Pueblo, Teresita fell in love with yet another founding member of El Pueblo, Alexander Barkley, and they subsequently married. So despite this amazing personality that she apparently possessed, she was described not only as beautiful, but obviously smart and clever. She was really the kind of person that anyone would want by their side on the frontier, regardless of gender. We only have this single image of Teresita. And the only pertinent facts we have about her life are facts like from the court case. But she is also symbolic of these multi-ethnic families that lived at El Pueblo. We also know that some of the other trappers and traders married Native American women and took them as wives. And so there's a lot of different cultures that are coming together to create families and trading partnerships at El Pueblo that is kind of emblematic of the messiness and the cultural mixing and clashes that are occurring just in general along the borderlands of the Mexican-American border at this time. There are also others who must have lived at El Pueblo, but we know almost nothing about their lives. And this would include Mexican-American laborers who were most likely responsible for actually constructing the fort and helping to do things like maintain the post and the livestock and do all the daily things that need to be done for survival. El Pueblo itself was an adobe fort of unknown dimensions. Some of the Old West style characters at the end of their lives wrote fanciful autobiographies where they claimed the fort was as big as 60 yards on a side. This would have actually made El Pueblo larger than Penn's Fort in at least one dimension. So we know very little about the physical characteristics of El Pueblo. We know that from many descriptions of people who traveled through the area that the fort was described often as rough or rude, that it had individual rooms on the inside of the fort, which did contain a plaza, with a possibility of additional houses, also probably of adobe, and maybe a very few log buildings outside the walls. The fort was low. It was no more than 8 feet high, and it lacked a parapet, so it was not very defensible. At various points in its history, it had yakal walls, and yakal are these woven wood structures that are finished with dirt or clay. It's very similar to wattle and daub, if people are familiar with that kind of construction, particularly from the eastern United States. And El Pueblo would occasionally have had a wooden picket line, although it doesn't seem to be maintained as different visitors describe it and then others leave it out of their descriptions. More often than not, the gates were described as broken, and the wooden doors and windowsills or openings were shrunken or rotting. So this was not a prosperous place, nor a well-kept place. And in many ways, it was a very transient place. There is a single known contemporary depiction of the fort, and it's a sketch by a young soldier, William Queensbury, who kept a sketch diary of his travels throughout the West. And he briefly stayed at El Pueblo in 1850. So Queensbury also sketched other places on his journey through the West, places that are more well-known than El Pueblo. And those are sketches that are considered faithful representations of where he visited. And so people have a certain degree of confidence that this is an accurate depiction of what El Pueblo may have looked like. For the decade plus that the fort existed, El Pueblo really seems to have been unremarkable, as I said. The occupants spent their time trading and attempting various other forms of subsistence, such as farming and buffalo ranching, and are what I usually characterize as just a bunch of yahoos on the border trying to figure out their lives. But to me, as a historical archaeologist, this is also where the story of El Pueblo starts to get interesting. And you see a more complete picture of life in the borderlands. In historic documents, Indian agents complain that the folks from El Pueblo, and these are the well-known founders, people like Matthew Kincaid and James Beckworth, are not getting the proper licenses that are needed at the time to trade with Native Americans and indigenous peoples in the West. There's also complaints that they're running items like liquor and selling that to indigenous peoples, which was illegal at the time. At one point in time, Kincaid, Teresita, and Simpson also attempted to have a buffalo ranch. And the way that they were trying to stock their ranch is that purportedly they were sneaking out onto the plains and they were trying to rustle newly born wild bison. This was a venture that did not last very long and was not very successful. They seem to have given up on the idea after about just a year or two. So eventually, the original founders of El Pueblo drift away. And they start small ranches or townships in nearby locations. Others drift away to other parts of the West and other states to take on other adventures. And new folks drift in to take up that niche that El Pueblo served on the frontier. This conduit between Mexico and the United States, and serving this function of bringing various goods to native peoples and other groups of folks who are living in the West at the time. So El Pueblo survived the shifting of international borders. In 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 525,000 acres of land are transferred from Mexico to the United States. By then, El Pueblo was already in a much diminished role compared to its heyday earlier in the decade. Much of what I find interesting about the unremarkable existence of El Pueblo is that during this whole period, it is largely left alone. So leading up to 1848, there is a war with Mexico over that international border. Many, if not all, the forts and trading posts during this era faced high levels of violence. Forts would forge alliances with certain groups, but it often left them vulnerable to distrust and attack from other groups. And Bent's is a really good example of all of this conflict and turmoil that's going on. While the relationship between the Bent family and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho tribes is nearly legendary, Bent lacked these same relationships with other plains or intermountain tribes such as the Ute or the Apache. Forts and trading posts also faced competition and potential for violence from each other and from other forts. And again, you know, Bent's fort is the dominant place in this time. And Bent was notorious for the brutality that he displayed at quashing his competition. He did not suffer competing with other forts and trading posts at this time, no matter how remote or weak they may have seemed. What's interesting is there's almost no evidence that during its history, El Pueblo faced any of this turmoil and conflict. They didn't face violence from Bent, who was happy to turn a blind eye and ignore them in their adventures, which were only 70 miles away from Bent's fort. And they don't seem to have faced a lot of conflict with native tribes. That is until Christmas Day, 1854, when a group of Ute and or Apache, accounts vary, attacked the fort. So by this time in 1854, all of our old West-style personalities had left for greener pastures. There were a number of people still living at the fort, and it may have been upwards of 30. And they were most probably many people who were Mexican or people of Mexican descent. And many of these people were killed during the Christmas massacre. Again, we have a lot of differing accounts, but it was anywhere from 8 to 30 people were killed in the conflict, and 2 boys were taken captive. What's interesting is that the survivors of this attack made their way to Fort Massachusetts, where we do have some very sketchy accounts of what the survivors were reporting to the soldiers there. So after this attack, the fort melts back into the landscape and the location was largely lost. So to someone like me, to an archaeologist, I think it's not only the archaeology that's interesting, but also the story of archaeology. And in a lot of ways, archaeological sites lead multiple lives. There's that whole life that creates the actual archaeological site. So the building of the fort, the people who live there, the things they bring into trade, their personal items, the things they eat and their livestock, and all the social stuff that creates an artifact assemblage for us to find later. But sites always have a second life, and that second life is as the archaeological site. And everything that a site experiences and endures, upon discovery and investigation. And this second life is almost as interesting as the first. And for El Pueblo, I think that is definitely true. And so the story of the first archaeologist who worked there, Dr. William Buckles, I think is so integral to understanding what we know about El Pueblo and the multi-component site that sits there now. So within a few short years of the fort's destruction, what is today the city of Pueblo was founded, and the legend of El Pueblo really became the heart and soul of the city. An interest in the site never died, even though its location was lost for decades. The city of Pueblo itself was incorporated in 1870, and when it was platted, they specifically took the name from the fort as part of their identity. And so they really saw themselves as an extension of that early settlement. In the 1930s, there was a surge of interest in the history of El Pueblo, and a local Pueblo historian recorded oral histories with citizens who claimed that they remembered the fort, and some even drew maps of the layout from memory. In the 1950s, the Colorado Historical Society, today that's History Colorado, built the El Pueblo History Museum. I think it was actually finally erected in 1959. And that was built near where the original site of the fort was supposed to be. The 30s, the Daughters of the American Revolution had erected a monument there in the 1930s based on vague oral histories. It was in the late 1980s that Dr. William Buckles decided to find the site, and he undertook a study to see if he could identify where the original fort was. He started with a lot of typical methods that we still use today. He used ground penetrating radar, but for a city that had experienced several devastating floods over the past century, it was really of limited utility. He also used old aerial photos to identify how the Arkansas had meandered, trying to tie the site to the banks of the river, and sand-borne insurance maps to try to understand the evolution of the city, where things were built, how they may have changed through time, and maybe seeing if he could walk back to where the original site was. But the real breakthrough came when a member of the community brought this photo to him. And it's a photograph dated from 1873. It's a broad picture. It's taken at an oblique angle of what was then the town of Pueblo. But the unknown photographer at the time had identified the remains of the corners on the photograph. So here you can see that it is demarcated where the structure of El Pueblo was supposed to have been. This is Dr. Buckles' copy that has annotations. Obviously, the 1873 photographer would not have probably had quite that style of arrows and such on his photo. But Buckles contacted a colleague who did mathematical models, and they estimated where the photo was taken from and where within the modern city the ruins might be. From there, Buckles identified several locations and performed ground truthing. In other words, he started digging holes, which is what archaeologists do best. The rest, as they say, is history, as Buckles identified where the site of El Pueblo was. Bill developed a really robust public archaeology program before there was such a term. So along with his wife, Nancy, and that is the two of them pictured at the bottom of the screen. Nancy ran the lab, and she was really instrumental in identifying and cataloging the immense numbers of artifacts that ended up coming off the site. Buckles excavated the site for about 12 years, which was as long as the trading post itself had been in existence. What's really amazing is I've given this talk a few times around the state, and I hear over and over again from so many of the volunteers who worked with Bill and Nancy how they wouldn't turn anyone away from the project, and just how important it was that this was truly a community-driven and participant-driven project. I think what you can also see is, partly based on the way that Bill and Nancy approached this site, is that it was important to the city, and is still really important to the city. And when I say it's important to the city, I mean not only you know, groups of people who are citizens of Pueblo, but also like the city as a municipality, and how they interacted with the project under the Buckles, how they've cared for the site and the artifacts since the project ended, and their continuing stewardship of the site. In terms of what I hear from people who took part in this, literally uncovering the history of the site as a community pursuit has really been a point of pride for Pueblo today. And I think, especially with our contemporary emphasis on public archaeology projects, there's a lot to learn from how the Buckles approached this one. The first major archaeological development that Bill identified was that the ruins of El Pueblo was under the Feres. The Feres was a 100-room hotel that had been built in 1882. The Feres has its own interesting history. It had a sulfur spring, which was marketed as lithium water, and it really seems to have been a high-end hotel for visitors to southeastern Colorado at the end of the 19th century. The hotel itself closed in 1904, but the building was subsequently used for retail space and a boarding house prior to being abandoned in the late 20th century. The hotel itself was a brick and stucco Federalist-style two-story building that was built by well-known architects Weston and Trost. As part of historic downtown, it would have been eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. However, it was not listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Sometime in the early 1990s, the city actually decided to demolish the building so that Buckles could more easily access the archaeological site of El Pueblo. It was also at this time that the El Pueblo History Museum was moved adjacent to the actual site. So if you visit the El Pueblo History Museum today, that was completed in, I think around 2002 or 2003. And it is built next to the El Pueblo archaeological site and bears its name. So History Colorado has always really been involved with both the legend of and the archaeology of El Pueblo, along with the city and the people who live there. Unfortunately, Dr. Buckles passed away in 2004 from a swiftly advancing terminal illness. Nancy had passed away almost a decade earlier, I believe around 1995. So Bill was a consummate professional. He wrapped up the excavations. He completed the high-level laboratory analysis. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of doing field and lab work, lab analysis takes approximately 4 times as long as the field work. So if you're in the field for a week, then it typically takes 4 weeks to get the lab analysis done. He did end up publishing a very tiny volume describing his search for El Pueblo and what they found archaeologically. And you can get that book at most of the History Colorado sites, both in Denver and down at El Pueblo. It's really notable that the volume is tiny because Bill was actually really known for producing really detailed and long monographs. The story about Bill in grad school at CU Boulder, and I have no idea how apocryphal it is or not, but it's definitely kind of become part of Colorado archaeology legend, is that he had to carry his 3-volume PhD around in a wheelbarrow because it was just too heavy and unwieldy to carry around campus otherwise. So the city of Pueblo built a pavilion over the site, and that still exists today. There's an 8-meter by 15-meter excavation block that was left open as an educational tool. The El Pueblo History Museum has taken a generation of students of 4th grade and younger kids through that pavilion to see that excavation block and to learn about the El Pueblo trading post. Bill also left 110 boxes of artifacts and over 20 linear feet of excavation notes and maps. There's also 2 large filing cabinets of additional materials. A majority of the artifacts in those boxes are actually from the Feres Hotel in the late 19th and early 20th century history of Pueblo, and not from the El Pueblo trading post. And we're really only starting to interpret the bulk of those materials, but I will talk about that a little bit today. All of this stuff from the excavations was orphaned after his death. The city adopted it, and they stored it away as best as they could in a basement of one of the municipal buildings. And I will say that this photo often gets some gasps, but this was a locked room in the basement of a secure building. It was dry. Things are up on shelves and pallets. The materials were not housed in archival boxes, but that's essentially how Bill left them, but things were labeled. I think a few things have gone missing over the years, mostly because people have made, exhibits at El Pueblo or have used them for other educational purposes, and they've gotten separated. But for the most part, I really want to stress that, the city has really done an incredible job stewarding this site and these materials and carrying on the Buckles legacy. Obviously, as you're all here with me today, interest in this site has never died. Back in 2015, the city embarked on a master plan to decide what to do with that kind of ugly pavilion. It's now in the middle of a pretty thriving downtown area. Many of you who visit the El Pueblo Museum know how popular that is. And so there's questions about how to better incorporate that site into both the life of the city and into interpretation at the museum. And that pavilion hinders a lot of access. 2015 also just happens to be when I came into my position as the state archaeologist. And so I took an interest in the site. I took an interest in the master plan. I felt a lot of responsibility for that orphaned collection and wanted to help the city. And back then I thought that I would just facilitate rehousing the collection and archival materials, and I would help the city find a more appropriate place to store it. And I'd be done by Christmas. But like so many people before me, as I got into the history and I got into the collection itself, I was really taken with the possibilities of what these materials could tell us. Not only about El Pueblo, but also about the Feres Hotel and the history of the city of Pueblo in general. So, like Bill, I have made public participation a central tenet to the work at El Pueblo. And I may have gotten a little off of my, I'm going to go back. I may have gotten a little off of my PowerPoints. In the spring semester of 2017, we set up a lab at the El Pueblo History Museum. And leading up to that, we were struggling to figure out how we were going to handle 110 boxes of materials. My office is in Denver. My home is in Longmont. Pueblo is, you know, on the opposite end of the Front Range as all of that. And so we weren't sure about the logistics. We didn't really want the collection to leave Pueblo. It has subsequently, but we can talk about that as well. I kind of got a nudge when I got a call from a professor at CSU Pueblo who was looking for internship opportunities for some of his students. He was an archaeologist and he wanted them to get some hands-on experience. He also called the city of Pueblo first to inquire, and they got really excited that there was potentially students who wanted to work on this project. So I contacted Dawn DePrince down at El Pueblo, and I asked her if there was a back room or a classroom that we could take over like once a week for the semester with a couple of people to do some lab analysis. And Dawn said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. We can set you up. So we showed up for our first day of lab, and Dawn and her staff had built a lab in one of the gallery spaces for us. And they had this beautiful sign, Searching for El Pueblo, the archaeology of Pueblo's origins. And we became part of the museum. We had more than a couple of volunteers. We had a couple of students, and then we had usually on average almost 15 people every week showing up to help us with lab analysis. And these were not just folks from Pueblo. We had people who drove from all over the Front Range every week. One person, Lynn Hoy, all the way from Parker every week to help us out with this. So it was a really popular project. At the end of the semester, we actually lost our space, which, you know, galleries have other uses. And most of our volunteers drifted off for the summer. I had 3 intrepid ladies who continued work. And at this point, we kind of had what I call dueling labs, where we had Pam and Renee doing work in the library and fountain, and Lynn was heading up our Denver branch. And so it was at this point in time that we did start bringing some of the artifacts out of Pueblo and up to Denver to get volunteers to continue working on them. When we first started this back in 2017, I estimated that it was probably going to take us 3 to 5 years to get all of the artifacts recatalogued and rehoused. And we are actually now finished with the rehousing, and it was 2 years ahead of my estimated time frame. So the volunteers and the students have just really been amazing in really working through this enormous collection. I've also been incredibly fortunate to have the smart minds of some of these anthropology students, specifically from Metro and CSU Pueblo, who've been doing some studies on some of the artifacts, and I'm going to highlight a couple of those today as well. Just coming up with some really interesting stuff to teach us about what Pueblo used to be like. So in the end, we had about 117,000 artifacts that have been recatalogued and rehoused. And most of these, as is probably not a surprise to any of you, date from the Feres Hotel period. Here is just a quick visual shot of some of the artifact classes. Most of the artifacts were metal fragments. A lot of it is, you know, damaged and rusted, non-diagnostic. We had a lot of nails, which we separated from the rest of the metal as well. But we do have a lot of diagnostic artifacts in ceramic, glass bottles. We have a lot of potential in the bone that was recovered in understanding not only food ways, but also some environmental factors. And so with that success, we are finally able to take a deep dive on these artifacts and start more thorough analyses. And that's really what we've been working on the last several months to a year. And so as we move this project forward, I myself have some new research questions that we are basing very much on what the Buckles research questions were. So mainly, you know, what was the role of the El Pueblo trading fort on the southeastern borderlands? And did that role change with the change in international boundaries in 1948? You know, how can El Pueblo teach us about the multi-ethnic experience on the 19th century borderlands? And how was identity experienced and constructed? And finally, one of my areas of focus has always been, even before I came to Colorado, on conflict. And so I'm really interested in understanding the effect of conflict and the absence of conflict at this site on these pluralistic cultures in the American West. And we really think that we are starting to see some of these questions be answered. So one of the more interesting artifact types that we have are kaolin smoking pipes. And kaolin is that white clay, and you can see some of the pipes here. A couple of our examples are actually more like terracotta than kaolin. But these are the sorts of smoking pipes that we often associate with archaeological sites like Jamestown, right? Like we think of these very much as like colonial artifacts. In fact, in some parts of the world, these were used not only through the 19th century, but into the early 20th century. We have over 130 fragments of pipes, many of them nearly complete. And a large proportion of them have diagnostic features such as the bowl that are still intact. What's really interesting is the El Pueblo collection is really large. And it contains a larger sample size than most collections. And when I say most collections, I'm comparing it to other forts in this era and in this region. So 130 is a huge sample size. We had a student, Aubrey from Metro. I have ASU up there because she has since moved on to graduate school at Arizona State. So we're very proud of Aubrey. But Aubrey did some research into these pipes. And one of the things that she found that was interesting is that these pipes lack certain identification marks that are typically found on fort sites. So if you see this picture in the upper right has these stamps on it, and these are maker's marks. Sometimes the maker's marks are names, sometimes they're symbols, just like with other maker's marks. But the production of kaolin pipes was regulated by a guild system in the UK. And they were primarily manufactured in the UK and in Britain and in Ireland. So in other assemblages from fort sites at this time in the West, we find 50% or higher ratio of the tobacco pipes have these maker marks. We do not have a single maker's mark in our entire assemblage, nothing. And while many of the bowls carry decorative motifs that are common, there's other telltale signs that these pipes are not high quality manufactured items. There's really messy seams from the molds, poorly bored holes in the stem. They just appear to be really hastily made. The number of them and the fact that so many of them were found in a group together, so they're not scattered across the site, indicates to me that these were being used as trade or sale items. So we're still conducting research, but Aubrey and I are really convinced that these items are created outside of that regulated guild system and that they're really created by the black market for a black market trade. It's also possible that they're not coming from the East Coast and not coming from the UK, but they're actually being traded through the Caribbean and Mexico. What I love about this set of artifacts is that it meshes with some of my other thoughts about El Pueblo. So remember how earlier on in the talk, I discussed how Indian agents were complaining that traders were running liquor and doing other illegal activities. And I also discussed how Bent Fort was largely leaving them alone. So my current hypothesis is that El Pueblo really fit a niche on the borderlands that allowed access to the black market. It's a market that Bent's Fort couldn't operate in outright because Bent's Fort was too high profile. And so they needed to maintain the appearance of legal operations. And so El Pueblo may not have only been operating on the black market to serve its own financial needs, but it may have actually been an arm of Bent's Fort that Bent couldn't otherwise access. And that's why they weren't facing the sort of attacks from Bent that other forts are getting at the time. So I'm really excited to continue down that avenue of research and see if there are other classes of artifacts from the El Pueblo period that that either support that hypothesis or that point me in other directions. But I find it really exciting with these kaolin pipes. So while the El Pueblo story is generally the more exciting and romantic aspect of the research for a lot of people, we're also really seriously looking at the Feres materials to understand how life evolved and changed in the city of Pueblo. And I actually think we're really lucky that Buckles excavated and curated this collection, because they very easily could have chucked it all aside as overburden and continued just for their search. And I think we're already finding out some fun things. So for instance, we had another student at Metro State, Josh Schofield, who did a wonderful study of faunal remains. And what he identified was a large number of lamb and mutton being served in the early decades of the hotel's existence. And this was at much higher quantities than was typical of other hotels in the period based on archival research. Much of that meat appears to be being traded from the San Luis Valley, which is great to have that regional connection, and we see these trade networks in historic Colorado. There was also cuts of bison that were served to guests in the hotel. And so, you know, what Josh came up with is that kind of this higher consumption, or this higher than average consumption of these types of meats may be due in part to the fact that the Feres was really trying to sell this idea of a Western experience. And so while other high-end hotels are trying to emulate the coasts and shipping in and importing foods from New York, from California, even from Washington, the Feres seems to have doubled down on building this more Western brand. Another interesting analysis that has been done is on the bottles excavated from the Feres. And this was an analysis that was done by a Colorado CSU Pueblo student, Lee Marshall. And the assemblage he looked at, and he didn't end up looking at the entirety of all the bottles that were collected, but it was a random sample, so it should be fairly representative of everything that we were looking at. They date primarily from 1885 to 1930, so right in the hotel era. And we see a really high volume of alcohol and medicinal bottles. And we believe that around the turn of the 20th century, the Feres was not simply just a high-end like layover hotel or destination, but it was also a destination for people who were recuperating from illness, which was common for many places along the Front Range and in other parts of Colorado. Colorado was really seen as this salubrious place to rehabilitate from really serious chronic illnesses. I don't know if these fit in with facilities in places like Denver and Colorado Springs, or if there was a network, but that's also something that we're hoping to continue to research as we move through our artifact and archival analysis. Okay, guys, I promise we're almost done. I know I've thrown a ton of information at you. I'm wrapping this up. There's still a lot of questions and we still have a lot of analysis to complete and interpretations to come up with. But I guess a big question about this is, why does it matter, right? If we know the history of the El Pueblo trading post, why was it important for Bill to locate the site of El Pueblo in the first place? Or why is it important for us to understand the Feres if, it was a site that was given so little regard that the city tore the building down? And for me, this is where we get into the foundations of why we do archaeology. The best archaeology, whether it's on prehistoric sites that are thousands of years old or more recent sites that may only be decades old, is done to answer questions about people who wouldn't or couldn't leave historical documentation. So archaeology is an approach to collecting data and asking research questions that elucidate the past in ways other disciplines cannot. And while we know something from some of the men who came from Bent's Fort to found El Pueblo, we really know nothing about the people who experienced their daily lives in those adobe walls, or what it can tell us about life on the borderlands. With a Feres component, we have the opportunity to learn about life in southeastern Colorado at the turn of the 20th century, when it's this relatively new Western state and how it fit into a still very young country. So the future directions of this study will delve into those people who are sometimes ignored by history, so we can truly understand the people who built this great state of Colorado. So I really hope that as we get more data and I can give more updates in the coming years, that you guys come back to revisit this subject with me. I have a ton of people to thank for this project, both for past work and continuing work. So thanks. I will turn my camera back on and I will see what sorts of questions you all came up with.